That's excellent. For those I've not had the opportunity to meet, my name is Frank Principi. I am your Woodbridge representative on the Prince William Board of County Supervisors. I've been in that role for about 10 years now, and I've been involved in this Fast Ferry issue for about 10 years as well. One thing I can tell you about myself is I'm a patient man. But you know, I see light at the end of the tunnel. I see an endpoint here. Today's summit, the National Capital Region Fast Ferry Summit 2017, is an opportunity to bring together the subject matter experts from business and government, from the military, academia, and the general public to begin or to continue to discuss what it's going to take to launch fast ferry service out of the Occoquan into the Potomac and all the way to the Anacostia River in the National Capital area here. And I see light at the end of the tunnel. You know, Woodbridge has been the crossroads for several hundred years. You think about it, not too far from here, we had a 500-acre plantation owned by George Mason. And in order to get supplies in and his crops out, what did he do? He built a wooden bridge over the Occoquan River. About 10 years after he built it, it washed away. What do you think George Mason and his sons did when that bridge, the wood bridge, was demolished in the flooding? He introduced fast ferry service, folks. This is about the 1760s, right? It was so successful that we had two other plantation owners introduce fast ferry service in this area as well. This is between 1760s and 1790s, okay? General Assembly in Virginia was so interested in this issue, they set the fare or the fee in order to take these ferries. It started out at 4 cents a man and 4 cents a horse. And over time, over that 30 or 40 year time frame, it got to 6 cents a man and 6 cents a horse. Now I'm going to tell my ferry owner operators who are here with us tonight, I know your fares are going to be more than 6 cents a man, and we won't be bringing any horses on board. But history repeats itself. We need fast ferry service in this region for a number of reasons. I mean, just look out these windows here at 123, Route 1, and Interstate 95. We have some of the worst traffic congestion in the country, not the region, the country. Texas Transportation Institute put out a report a year or two ago that said we have the most reliably unreliable transportation system in the country. We can do better than that, folks. We can transform our bus and rail service, we can carry more people, and we can use our last unused highway, the Potomac River, to get people to and from work. Little secret here, not something I like to share broadly, 2/3 of Woodbridge residents leave every day to go to work. We got to fix that. We got to bring employers here. We got to bring office space here, particularly to the Route 1 corridor. That's going to take some time. Fast ferry service is going to help us in between, right? My friends on the Board of County Supervisors, not so hot about bringing Metro Rail down here. Big price tag, bigger government, but I see fast ferry service as an interim step, an interim solution. But it's not just about relieving traffic on Route 1 and 95 and the bridges in and out of the District of Columbia. It's also about a secondary market of tourism. Did anybody read in the paper last week where Prince William County is the fastest growing tourism market in the Commonwealth of Virginia?
Yes.
That's impressive. You saw that in the paper. Fast ferry service is going to help us maintain the #1 spot in tourism. Why? Because I think people enjoy going to a baseball game out of Woodbridge. I think they'd enjoy going out to dinner at a white tablecloth restaurant in Alexandria. I think they'd enjoy going to a meeting or a conference at National Harbor. Do you realize how many people work at Fort Belvoir that live in Woodbridge? Or how many people work at National Harbor and the new MGM that live in Woodbridge? I'm going to tell you, we have a market for this service. But I've learned over the 10 years that, quite frankly, it's a bit complicated. You got local, state, and federal government involved. You got private sector, private industry, academia, military. And this is not an easy solution to our traffic problems. But I think with the people in this room, the people we had at lunch and the business meeting, those that rode the ferry at 2 and 4 o'clock today, I think together, collectively, the stakeholders that we brought together will help us figure out how to make this happen. It's not going to be overnight. I'm going to steal a little bit of thunder from one of our panelists who's going to tell you about new ferry service that's starting next month. And it's going to serve Georgetown and Alexandria and National Harbor and the wharf in Southeast DC. And he can tell you that I've been calling him and I've been emailing him and I've been seeing him at meetings, and I am his biggest thorn in his side because I'm not stopping until we get ferry service right here in Woodbridge. There are issues. We're working together. Eventually we're going to see it, hopefully in the next year or two. But it's not just about commuter traffic, not just about tourism. Anybody see the Miracle on the Hudson? What a great movie. Who was it that went out in the middle of the Hudson River and saved those people out of that airplane? Ferry owner operators. We can expand and improve our emergency preparedness with a fleet of ferry service, right? We can deal with National Airport potential accidents. But it's not just about emergency preparedness, it's also about Homeland Security. Who here was in the area, in the region on 9/11? And I worked across the street from the Capitol building on 9/11, and I remember very clearly trying to get home that night, down 395 down to 95. And as I was driving, smoke from the Pentagon was flowing right into all the cars on 395 coming southbound. I can tell you folks, Fast Ferry Service will help that situation with regard to evacuation, of getting VIPs and our military commanders, our elected officials out. You're not going to take 395 to get out of Washington, D.C. You're going to take the river. You're going to take Fast Ferry. So there's many, many purposes, many, many different reasons why we're looking at Fast Ferry Service. And I'm convinced that the folks behind me tonight have got part of the solution. It's a lot like a Rubik's Cube, right? It's pretty complicated to get all the colors on one side of the face of the cube. But between you and our subject matter experts here tonight, quite frankly, I know we can get it done. I know we can get it done. So with that, what I'd like to do is introduce the facilitator, the moderator for the panel tonight, somebody I've worked with closely over the years. He's formerly has some experience in transit services, which is key to the solution set that we're looking at. He's also been the mayor of Purcellville, and today he's the executive director of the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. And if that's an acronym, NVRC, that you're not aware of, you need to be aware of it. Because the elected officials from Northern Virginia all get together at his place. And we plan like crazy on a number of issues. And NVRC is the instigator, the moderator, the administrator, the facilitator that brings the elected officials together every day of the month in planning for such things as traffic congestion, Homeland Security threats, environmental matters, health issues. And I couldn't think of a better person to help facilitate tonight's panel than Bob Lazaro. Please welcome Bob to the podium.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for that kind introduction. And before we get into the panel, I too would just like to say thank you to Supervisor Principi and his staff for working to coordinate this event. Peggy Tadej of our staff, who works very closely on this issue, our partners at MARAD, and also the private sector folks who helped sponsor tonight's event here, the food and the beverage. We appreciate very much their cooperation and assistance. As Frank said, I'm former mayor of the town of Purcellville, did serve on the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, and I remember very fondly the discussion on this issue and voting to bring the consultants on board to take a look at the market study several years ago. We will be holding questions till the end after all of our speakers are finished. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. under penalty of, you know what? There are 2 ways to ask questions. Please raise your hand and someone will bring a mic to you, or there will be index cards that we could give to you if you're uncomfortable with using the microphone yourself. We have 4 speakers, and I will introduce them in the order that they're speaking. Our first speaker will be Captain James Bamberger, Deputy Director, Risk Analysis Division, Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, followed by Scott Davies, Tim Payne, and then William Polak. And I'll just read very briefly a little bit about each of our speakers. Currently, Captain Bamberger is Deputy Director of Risk Analysis Division at the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to this position, he served as the Chief of Port and Intermodal and Maritime Security branches for the department. He has over 35 years' experience in the maritime industry and continues to maintain an unlimited master's license. Scott Davies is the Director of Ports of the Office of Ports and Waterways Planning for the Maritime Administration. They've been real partners, and I should have mentioned a little bit earlier, the Deputy Administrator of the Maritime Administration said that this project served as a national model of people working together and cooperating to get to an endpoint. As Director of the Office of the Maritime, he's responsible for expanding and modernizing port infrastructure. And prior to joining the office in 2011, he served in the Office of Infrastructure Development and Congestion Mitigation since 2003. Since joining the Office of Ports and Waterways Planning and becoming Director, Scott has facilitated public and private partnerships, and that's what this is all about, and has continued to work and promote America's Marine Highway Program. Our next speaker will then be our consultant, Tim Payne. Tim works out of Seattle's office and is co-director of the firm's National Transit Practice. With over 40 years in transit discipline, Tim is uniquely qualified for the ongoing feasibility assessment of passenger ferries on the Potomac. And he's one of the few professionals in the industry with significant ferry operations experience, transit experience, and ferry transit integration. And not only that, he's a ferry fan and he's an avid ferry rider using it on his daily commute from his hometown. And last but not least is Willem Polak, who is a consultant. Mr. Polak resides in Glen Echo, Maryland, and I have an affinity for him because he was just elected mayor of Glen Echo in that city, that town, so congratulations, Willem. He was the owner of Potomac Boat and Tours and now Potomac Riverboat Company since 1972. He sold the company in 2016 and remains a consultant and advisor to entertainment cruises. With that, I will turn the podium over to our panel, and again, we will take questions at the end. So, gentlemen.
Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. All right. I usually, so I'm from South Philly and I have an Italian heritage. It's really tough for me to speak sitting down this confined, but I'll do my best. You know, if I start going like this, okay.
Sit back.
That was a pretty impressive title that I have right now, but I'm not here to talk about anything that has to do with intelligence and analysis or risk with the Department of Homeland Security. I'm here, and I want to thank Bob Schemmeld, who I worked with in the past, and Frank Principi for inviting me, because my background in the maritime stems from being a mariner since I was 18 years old, running the Staten Island Ferry as a what we call hawse piper, a deckhand, all the way up to captain and port captain of the Staten Island Ferry in New York, and then worked with and was on the ground floor of the high-speed ferry operators in Manhattan, which has now grown. If anybody's been to Manhattan lately, they look like little bugs driving around the water. There's hundreds of ferry operations in Manhattan, and we started the first one back in the 80s called Direct Line that ran from the Atlantic Highlands, which is the Jersey Shore, into Manhattan, and then evolved through there. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with startup operations as an operator of different ferry services, how the equipment procedures have evolved to make it safer, faster, more economical, and a better choice for commuters. And then switch to here, and I might go back and forth, switch to the challenges of an operation down here, and it couldn't have been a better description than a Rubik's Cube, because there are a lot of challenges, and if I was a consultant, I would call those opportunities, but challenges to starting a ferry service here on the Potomac, which I think with time, I know with time, they can all be overcome. And I think I've known Willem for, since we were teenagers, for 25 years, and he's overcome most of them. And I gotta say, you know, a lot of times in business, you can either be really, really good or stick to something long enough to make it succeed, and he's done both. So this is not an easy thing to do, I know, because I was part of a lot of successful operations in New York, and I was also part of an operation that didn't succeed here on the Potomac River. So Willem's stuck to it, and I think even in his pocket he's got a copy of something from one of our old proposals that he thinks has worked. So glad to see that still survives. But I'm going to start with what I think are 5 of the biggest challenges to completing and successfully operating a service like this. And I'll hit them broadly, but then I'll go back. So I would say first you have financial. You know, you need the financial wherewithal to go in for the long run and stay involved, because like any business, and Bob can tell you this, or anybody here who's done a startup, it always takes longer than you think, and it always costs more than you think, but if it's a good idea, you usually get it done. Then there's environmental challenges. You know, I'll compare New York to the Potomac back and forth. The environmental challenges are getting more difficult as time goes on. There's more concern about the environment, and I think this actually is an opportunity for real environmentally, because I'm going to read you a couple studies that were done back in the 90s that show that fast ferry service on the Potomac is actually more environmentally friendly than the other option, which would be driving. Okay? So when we looked at ferry service on the Potomac back in the late 90s, our target was the vehicle. We felt that we would get a tiny percentage of the person that's already commuting with mass transit, but because of the quality of mass transportation in the Washington metropolitan area and the access to it and the way communities are built around it, we didn't feel that that was our market. We felt our market was the automobile commuter. And I'm going to read you just a quick quote from a 1990 study, but it rings true today. In 1990, the Federal Highway Administration found that metropolitan Washington area transportation arteries have the worst congestion among the cities along the east coast of the United States. The highways that service metropolitan Washington area are more crowded and have slower average driving speeds than even New York City metropolitan area. Projections show congestion continuing to increase, as well as average driving speeds continuing to decrease for the highway service in this region. And anybody who's been here since the 90s can attest to that. It's true. So drive times are longer. The AM and PM commute windows have gone broader. And I know I live in Kingstown. If I'm not on the highway before 6 a.m., I take the back roads, or I just wait and go in later. I have that option. Most people don't. So that provides more opportunity now than I think there was back then. I'll give you another stat real quickly. So we did a study back in the 90s on hydrocarbon emissions and found that on average vehicles contribute 31% of Washington area's daily dose of man-made smog or hydrocarbons. And as far as I know, and I know I talked to some people today, DC is still a non-attainment area, so anything that can be done to reduce the amount of hydrocarbons in the DC area would be looked very favorably upon, and there's also grant dollars for that. So I did this for New York, but I transferred it to this area for this group. So a 50-mile round trip from Woodbridge would produce 24 to 28 grams of emissions per day for one vehicle. The same trip via high-speed commuter ferry and then we used a 149 passenger commuter ferry, would produce 2.3 grams of hydrocarbons per person. That doesn't mean the boat produces that. It means take the total amount of hydrocarbons for that 149 passenger vessel and divide that, and you're going to get a comparison of 2.3 grams of hydrocarbons compared to 24 to 28. Okay? That's it for the math, but it just shows you that high-speed ferries can be an environmental advantage, or give you an environmental advantage, and reduce the amount of hydrocarbons or smog in the area. So that, to me, is an environmental win for a ferry system. So yes, every combustion engine will produce pollution, but the trade-off is much, much less with people using the ferry. Okay? So I talked about financial a little bit, environmental. You've got a lot of environmental issues. You've got air, noise, wake. I want to sit on wake a little bit, and for those mariners in the room, I'm going to go to the more simple, and then for the guys who don't run boats at all, it might be too complicated. But boats produce wake, okay? There's two kinds of wake. There's a height of wake, and there's an energy that a boat produces. The boats now, and I know there's a gentleman from Metal Shark here, and some of the other gentlemen on this panel can talk to this probably better than I can. The boats have evolved to such a point now that they can attain high speeds and produce less wake than boats could 10, 15, 20, even 5 years ago. So we're finding now that boats can run at 25, 30, 45, 50 knots and have less wake than a traditional boat would have had even at 5 or 6 knots. So I know Willem's working on this, and I believed in it 30 years ago. There are some restrictions on the river. They're due to wake. I don't know if anybody took the ferry ride today and you saw the signs that said no wake zone. It doesn't say no high speed zone. So it's not telling you you have to go 3 knots or 5 knots or 20 knots. It's telling you you're responsible for your wake and the damage it does. But if you can produce a vessel that creates low wake at high speed, that would be acceptable. And I think that is something that we found in New York, and I think the same principle can be applied here. When I started running high-speed boats, and it's almost laughable in New York, and I say laughable, 20 knots was considered a high-speed boat back in the 80s. And those boats produced large amounts of wakes. And then as I saw the boats evolve to a catamaran, which you guys rode on today if you rode it, to water jet propulsion, which is similar to what a jet ski or a wave runner uses, the boats have gotten more efficient, meaning they use less fuel, they produce less smog or smoke, they run faster, cheaper. 15 minutes remaining, thanks. I'm just kidding. I told you once I got going. So what I'm trying to tell you is these guys will speak to it, but technology like we see in our daily lives is increasing, and it's increasing in the ferry world, and we're seeing better, faster, more feasible, more economic boats. And some other quick challenges, I'll try to move through them, but I'll take questions at the end or with the rest of the panel. You got regulatory challenges. Well, those take time, but I think they all can be, I won't say overcome, they can all be addressed. Because this is not new, and we've seen successful examples of other ferry operations in many cities throughout the United States. And I don't want to name them, they're too long, but they become a regular way of commuting for people now as part of a city's mass transit system. Operational, yeah, the Potomac's got some challenges. You've got ice, some years it freezes solid. You've got debris, we saw it today. But the boats can be made to address that. And there'll be some days you may lose if we get a really, really cold winter, but guess what? The VRE runs slow when it's really, really hot, I hear. So heat affects mechanical things, but I think all those can be addressed. I'm gonna stop for a second on something that I think is the biggest challenge, and it's not expensive. It's a behavioral challenge. When we started operating in New York, we had a history, decades and decades of prior ferry operations. I don't know how far back the Staten Island ferry goes, because I wasn't running it back then. And by the way, I wasn't running it when it crashed either, just in case you want to ask that question. It wasn't me. But when we we started running ferry service in New York, we could just point to that big yellow boat in the harbor and go, look, that carries 60,000 people a day into Manhattan every weekday. Over 21 million people a year take that mass transit vehicle to work. So why not a smaller version of that? Or why not a faster version of that? New York's not any different than DC. Our time is worth money. And whether it's our leisure time or our work time, there's a value to that. I think my leisure time is worth way more than my work time, and I think my bosses would agree. So I can tell you this, people are, especially in this area, I mean, within reason, they're willing to pay for time saving. Time's important to all of us. And so in New York, that barrier, much easier for us because it already existed and we were just adding to it. Here, it's new. Behavioral challenge is difficult. It's tough to get people to change. It's tough to get people out of their cars into another mode, and I think Willem's doing it right. He's going to demonstrate it, he's going to show it, and I think once it catches on, it'll catch on fast, but it's that initial proving. She's very strict, I want to say. So I'm going to stop here. If you have any quick questions for me, if anybody thinks of a challenge, I'd be happy to tell you how we addressed it in New York. Yes? No, we're holding till the end. So this is going to be a first time ever that I finish early, so I'm going to not do that. I'm going to just point to this one piece of the study, which is 1 minute. The study that was done that you see up on the board shows you the wake wash of a lot of existing vessels and how the vessel that this gentleman here has selected is the best. And it shows you very quickly how it produces low wake at high speed, is environmentally friendly, and I think the right one for this area. So, did I make it? Thanks.
My name is Scott Davies. I'm the Director of Ports and Waterways Planning at the Maritime Administration. And the mission of my team is, as part of the Marine Highway Program, it's DOT's effort to really get better utilization of our waterways for the movement of passengers and freight. And that's a nationwide program. Our nation is blessed with over 25,000 miles of inland waterways and coastlines, and including the Potomac right here. And they're heavily underutilized. As we build more roads, we build more rail lines, we can only afford to pay for so much. And as our population grows, the demands on our transportation system grow. It really makes sense to utilize our waterways. And that's why I'm really excited to see this project come to fruition right here in our nation's capital, because we really should be leading the way in terms of innovation and utilizing all the assets of our region, not just the ones we see every day and touch every day. The experience moving freight on the waterways, and there's a lot of experience moving passengers as well elsewhere. And one of the things, they're very common in terms of what people are looking for, whether you're shipping a package or shipping yourself. The things that people are looking for are really very similar. You want reliability and a competitive cost advantage. You want frequency and accessibility and connectivity. And so that's when we looked at how this service should be structured. Now, the foundation of it, I think, is great. My boss talked about it earlier in her remarks. That's partnerships. When I look at around the room and I look around the coalition that's been built to support this effort with Northern Virginia Regional Commission, DDOT, VDOT, MDOT, Prince William County, of course, leading the way, and PRTC, and several other organizations, including DHS and DoD and National Park Service, and I could go on and on. But there's a lot of players involved, and that are each coming at it from a different angle with different interests. But working together is what's going to make the difference this time around versus previous attempts in the past. It's that partnership that really makes a difference, and everyone pulling and rowing in the same direction. The second thing is operationals and the operational framework. you know, in order to make the service work, it's really got to be, it's got to connect with the landside modes, it's got to connect with bus routes and bike share and Metro Rail and VRE and all those. It has to be part of the whole system. It's not a system unto itself. And it's going to be, you know, have a reliable, frequent timetable, so people know that that ferry is going to leave at 6:30 in the morning or 7 in the morning, so they can depend on getting to work at a specific time, or catching that bus or wherever they're going. So they have to have it has to be well connected and synced up with the rest of the transportation system. The other third key factor is the financials, and it really has to pencil out. So we have to be able to make this, develop this service and offer it at an attractive rate that's competitive with VRE and with other modes, and with running as a complement to the other transportation system, but also to attract ridership. It's got to be competitively marketed, and I think my predecessor mentioned the most important challenge, and that's the psychological challenge. The getting people to change their behavior. That's going to be all the other things, the financials, the operational framework, the vessels, the docks. All those things are, you know, difficult but can be changed. But changing people's behavior is going to be the biggest challenge. Once you get those early adopters and you'll follow them up with converts, and people will see the benefit of riding the ferry every day. I can't imagine a more pleasant way to get to work than to have what most people would consider a lot of people pay a lot of money for, just to go for a boat ride, to do that every day on your way to work, and then to decompress on the way home every day, surrounded by beautiful scenery. That's one of the great things about the Potomac River. A lot of the shoreline is not developed, and so it's beautiful scenery going north and south, and it's a really great way to travel. And again, there's no congestion. There's hardly ever any boats on the river at all. Some pleasure craft on the weekends. So it really does make a lot of sense to look at the waterway at the Potomac River as a benefit and as something that can be added to the region's transportation system. Again, there are a lot of challenges, a lot of jurisdictional challenges. You know, you have the military that owns a lot of the shoreline. You have National Park Service that owns a lot of the shoreline. You have private industry. You have people with homes along the shoreline. You have some jurisdictions, you know, they're a little leery about parking and issues like that. So I think it's really important to bring them into the conversation and early on, to make sure that everyone understands what we're trying to do to develop a new form of transportation in this region. I don't know where I'm at on time. Oh, wow. Okay, so I've gone very short.
I knew I should have gone.
I can see the rest of my time to you. But that's really all I have, but I'll be happy to take any questions later on. It's appropriate.
Great. We'll get started. First of all, for those of you sitting on this side of the room, I'm going to be showing slides on that screen that's over there. So you have a choice. You can either move so you can see better, or you can listen to my voice. Yeah, please move. Exactly. Precisely. You got the message. I want to talk about the study that we're currently engaged with the Northern Virginia Regional Commission. We are doing what's called an infrastructure gap analysis, and that's just a really fancy way to say we're taking a look at potential terminal sites throughout the Potomac that are possible terminal sites for establishing ferry service from Woodbridge into the greater Washington, D.C. area. And we're trying to figure out, if we were to start the service at some point in the not too distant future, and we've defined that as 5 years, what's needed at those sites to make ferry service viable. So there's 2 rules about a ferry. Number 1, to be a ferry, you have to have at least 2 terminals, one at either end. So you have to have a place to land it. And the second rule is you have to have a way to get people on and off the ferry, or it's still not a ferry, because by definition, a ferry is to pick a person or a vehicle or freight up from one side of the water and to deliver it to the other. So if you don't have those 2 ingredients, you do not have a ferry. So they're very necessary ingredients. So this study is primarily focused on developing commuter markets. So we are specifically looking at the commuters in the Northern Virginia area, a little bit north of Woodbridge, but generally from Woodbridge south, who are going to places, to work at places like Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, or where my friend the captain comes from, the Department of Homeland Security headquarters that's being built at St. Elizabeth's Hospitals, where the United States Coast Guard is currently headquartered, just having moved within the last year and a half to that site. To southeast and southwest Washington, D.C., where there has been a substantial increase in waterfront development. Over the last 5 years, there's a brand new development called The Wharf that is just getting ready to open in DC, and when you have a chance to see it, it will blow your mind. It is beautiful. It is some of the most current development in Washington, D.C. It's probably some of the best development in Washington, D.C. And for the first time in probably 60 years, Washington, D.C. is once again turning its face towards the water. For many, many years, Washington, D.C. has turned away from the water, and what we're starting to see now is it's turning back to its roots, because its roots actually came from the water, came from the Potomac River. Everything depended on the Potomac River. Transportation, goods, services, everything depended on it. And at some point, it moved away, the community moved away from that. It's now starting to come back to it. So ferries are a very natural portion of that evolution. This is a map that shows some of the potential routes and some of the potential terminal sites. I won't bore you with all the details of every single one of those, but what I will tell you is that the terminal sites in particular are in many different stages of development or lack of development. Things we are looking for at terminal sites are really good connections with transit. In some locations, like in Woodbridge, parking has been mentioned a few times. We'll be looking for sites that have parking either immediately adjacent or available through a short shuttle ride. By the way, one of the ferry boat trips that I take to work every day, I park at a park and ride lot that's 2 miles from the ferry dock and get on a shuttle bus to go to the ferry dock. So your answer, your question, will people actually do that? Yeah, absolutely. 5 o'clock in the morning, we have a bus load of people getting on at that park and ride lot and riding down to the ferry. So people will absolutely do that sort of thing. There are a number of other infrastructure details that we'll be evaluating and looking at, the suitability of this site, whether we can control the site, that sort of thing. And by control, I mean, do we have access in and out of it all the time? The last thing you want to do is discharge a bunch of commuters off the ferry and they come up to a locked gate and they can't get out. People get really testy about that because they can't get to work on time, right? So in terms of conditions, we have all the way from this, basically there's nothing but a bulkhead on the waterfront there. So this would be very difficult to land a commuter ferry at this site without some additional development. All the way to this, where you have a not only fully developed facility, but one that is already hosting ferry service. So there's commercial ferry service operating. This happens to be National Harbor, operating in and out of National Harbor for about, what is it, well, 9 months out of the year?
2007.
But how many months out of the year you're running now to National Harbor? 10 months out of the year. So every day we have commercial ferry service operating in and out of this site, and soon to be joined, that's from Alexandria, soon to be joined by service from the Wharf also in downtown DC. So again, there are sites that are already fully developed, and what we're trying to assess is, if we were looking at this site for establishing commuter ferry service, is there anything else that we need at this site? By the way, if you walk up this gangplank that you're looking down, you walk about maybe a block, maybe a little bit of a long block, there's a bus stop right there that will take you right up to the MGM Grand Casino. It's literally a very close walk from this facility. So this facility is fully designed, ready to go today. We could start operating a boat there today, but like I say, it's got to have some place to come from, or you don't have a ferry. So what is an infrastructure gap? Just basically, it's the difference between what exists today and what's needed to start commuter ferry service within about a 5-year horizon. And we set that 5-year horizon because Frank, bless his heart, keeps pushing us to get ferry service started. So we're trying to keep our planning horizon really close. There are lots of things you can do if you have a lot of money and a lot of time. And in this particular case, we're trying to get ferry service started on the Potomac in a commercially viable manner in a fairly short time frame. So a lot of the longer term things we've set off to the side and said, we'll take that on for a future consideration. But for now, let's look at what we can do today to get ferries operating on the Potomac. This is just a quick map. It's a lot easier to see it over here, by the way. It's exactly the same map. It is really one of the best pictures that I've seen of what ferry service in the long term on the Potomac could look like. Some of the potential terminal sites, some of the potential markets connecting up and down the Potomac from even further down the Potomac than we are right now, as far down as Quantico, and all the way into Washington, D.C. and across the Potomac in several different locations. I'd encourage you to kind of take a look at that and dream a little bit with me about what's possible using this marine highway system that we have that's so underutilized now in the Occoquan, Potomac, and Anacostia River. I'm going to pause here and I want to introduce one of my partners on this project from Elliott Bay Design Group. I want to give you a little eye candy and talk about some of the vessel design and some of the terminal design considerations that we're looking at a little bit from this part of the world and a little bit from the Washington, D.C. area. And also talk just a little bit more about some of the wave wash characteristics that the captain started to refer to. And for those of you who want to really geek out on that sort of thing, this will really help you because there's some really cool charts in here. Nick, here's the, yeah, that's fine. Here's the.
All right. So one thing a lot of people are going to be wondering are, what boats are we looking at? We hear a lot of terms coming out of Captain Bamberger. There's mouth talking about fast ferries, energy efficient, low wake wash, and this is kind of what we're looking at. There's some 3 different examples of fast ferries already in service and about to be built. We've got the San Francisco Bay ferry fleet, and they're operating over a dozen boats in the San Francisco Bay area, and they're anywhere from 250 to 450 passenger boats, operating 25, 30 knots, regularly serving commuters throughout the Bay Area. And I think we talked a little bit about already the challenges of this area. We've got navigational challenges, the environmental challenges. So that all goes into the design process. And what we looked at bringing here is the best vessel for this service. So taking into consideration all of those challenges, which I guess as a consultant we would see as opportunities, as mentioned earlier. So you have those considerations of passenger loading, trying to bring a lot of people in rapidly, making the boats safe, so operating at night, day and night, up and down the Potomac in various conditions. Maneuvering of the boats on and off the dock, and of course looking at terminals to provide all the services needed to those specific boats, and long-term maintenance to support the whole ferry fleet. It's not just about terminals to get people on and off the boat, but terminals to support that fleet in a long-term manner. And just one example of such a terminal, this is a maintenance and passenger loading float for the WITA, the San Francisco Bay ferry fleet. And what they do there is one specific terminal that is used for maintaining their fleet. They have various terminals throughout the area where they're loading passengers and distributing people around, but this is one that they're using to maintain the fleet and to fuel and unload all their gear. Just some fun pictures here. Looking at what a jet boat actually is. This is water jet propulsion. So we can geek out on that a little bit more later, but kind of looking at moving away from props for shallow water operations, for high-speed operations. and wake wash is one of those things that's widely concerned, I guess, for these high-speed ferries. It's kind of a common misconception that fast boats equal large wake and large impact on the environment from those wakes. And what we've seen over the years is a lot of advance in that technology into improving wake wash characteristics, and we'll look at very specific things with hull designs to mitigate that. We've seen with new boats that are about to appear with the Potomac Riverboat fleet, very long hulls, very narrow hulls, and specifically designed to mitigate the energy impacts from those wakes. So here you can see kind of 4 different designs. The new Potomac Riverboat fleet, Thames Clipper boats, and kind of looking back at the wake, and that's from a boat doing close to 30 knots. Looking at the boat out of the water, you can really see the unique hull characteristics. Some technical graphs kind of explaining all that, but in general, what you'll notice from this is kind of comparing vessel speed to wake height. And the wake height has a very distinct, almost direct correlation to the energy density. And most boats kind of have this peak hump speed where they have to get up and break out of that before you see a lowering of the wave impacts. So with common technology today, with CFD modeling and scale testing, we can really get an understanding of the characteristics of a new design and make sure that it's meeting the criteria for the particular area. All right, thank you.
I'm the wrap-up guy. My first name is Willem. It's a Dutch name, so it's appropriate that I'm the boat guy as well, I think. But I wanted to tell you, I guess, a little bit, and I don't think I'll take 15 minutes. Jim took a lot of my thinking a little bit, boat captain like him. And we have running boats in the Potomac River since the early 70s. And most recently, I've built, as you've seen this picture in your magazine, of 4 water taxis that we're building for the Wharf Project in Southwest Washington. And I wanted to give you a little bit of a history so you get a feel, and I'll probably put some numbers on some of these things so you can get a feeling for the magnitude of getting into the boat operation. It's not a project you do as a pilot program, I can tell you. But we carry 350,000 people today. It's a big number, 350,000 people today in water transportation with our boats. And that's not including these boats that are coming to the wharf starting October 12th, 2 of them coming then, another 2 coming in March, and we believe that'll add another 100,000 passengers to our already 350,000 passenger load factor. So it's something we do for a living, something we enjoy very much. For those of you who rode on the Miss Mallory Day, you see how pleasant it is to get out on the river and just sort of scoot around and get to see things. But this is a very viable area to run a water transportation system. I think what makes it interesting for us is the number of people that live in this area that also work, as you've heard, in the Washington, D.C. area, that work at MGM, for instance, National Harbor, that work at the Navy Yard. You've got these quadrants, sort of the federal area, where you have 60,000 people working down in Southwest. You've got 60,000 people at the yards. Across the Anacostia, you've got DHS, you have the Navy Yard, you've got JBAT, so forth and so on. So you've got a lot of people that are living outside the Washington metropolitan area, coming, many of them from this area of Virginia, that would like to get to work and not sit on 95 and spend their day there. To build a boat for this area is somewhere in the $10 million range per boat, to give you a feel, sort of put some mustard on this sandwich a little bit. And the infrastructure cost probably on the shore side, maybe up to $5 million. So just to get off, while you can't have a pilot program, $15 million to start this operation. And the next boat is going to probably cost you $10 million. And why is it so expensive? These boats, again, I refer to these are $2.5 million apiece. They're 22 knot, 149 passenger boats, to give you some perspective. What we're talking about for Woodbridge is a 300 to 400 passenger boat that's capable of going 40 knots. So twice as fast as these boats. What does that mean? I can get you from here to Southwest Waterfront to Navy Yard in under an hour, probably closer to 45 minutes. So there's a real interest and a real desire for people to make that trek. And one of the, I think, the things we've talked about and heard today is that behavioral issue. You know, what's going to get them out of their car? What's going to get them into a boat? Well, if I can give them Wi-Fi and they can have a cocktail and they can sit back and view this beautiful river and make it to work in 45 minutes, that may be an attractive factor. It's not inexpensive. We're thinking it's $30 round trip. Well, of that, if you're a government employee, $12.25 today is subsidized by the feds. So it's $18 or $9 each way out of your pocket to make this ride. Is it worth it? We think so. How do you deal with wake? We look at the Anacostia, we look at the Occoquan. You can either run slow, even a low wake boat going up, getting up on speed is going to create a wake. So you're talking about a thing called wave attenuators. And for those of you who swim in a pool, those little float things that are each side of you keep your wake from bothering the guy that you make in the next lane. Well, these wave attenuators are a little bigger and they go deeper in the water and they get rid of the energy in the water. But they're $500 a linear foot. So if you think that we're running a mile or so on this river and multiply that 5,000 so many feet, and you have one on each side, so you double that, you get a feel for the cost of putting in wave attenuators so you can run fast and reduce the time limit. If you ran from here to the buoy 52 out in the main river, instead of running at 5 knots, you can run at 20 knots or 30 knots. You can see you reduce that time from 20 minutes, let's say, down to 10 minutes or less. Time is the element that we're really talking about here, and the cost of these engines for these boats that make them go faster than the other boats add $1 million or $2 million to each of these boats. So there's a lot of money in this project. Where we are today, we're trying to determine what is the market here. You know, how many people work at JBAB, for instance, or Navy Yard, or take any of these places that live in the Woodbridge area? They can park up in here, can get on the VRE station off at the VRE station at Belmont Bay and get on a shuttle bus and come to the dock. We don't know that answer. It takes a year to build a boat. Is it viable? Yes. Are we interested? Yes. Can we fund it? Yes. So we're a willing partner. We're the private sector. We don't have to wait on the MARAD money, no offense. You know, we don't have to go through some of the problems a lot of people have to go through to fund projects like this. But we need to know that there's a market there that we can really satisfy. Where do we run? I guess I would just let you know that on the north in Washington, we run Georgetown. We're putting a dock in at the Kennedy Center. We run the National Mall. We're putting another dock in there. On the Anacostia, we run to the Nats Stadium. Sometimes we're running 3 or 4 boats to the Nats game because those boats are sold out. It's a great example. If you want to go to the Nats game and you live in Alexandria, Virginia area, you got a 35, maybe a 40-minute drive. You're going to spend $25 to park your car. And then when you get out, you're going to wait 15 or 20 minutes to try and get your car out of the parking lot. And if you ride Metro, you may be waiting 20 minutes for the next Metro train to come and get you back, and the cost of that. So our boat ride from Alexandria up the Anacostia to the Nats Stadium, and you walk off the boat and you walk right at the first base side of the stadium, is 30 minutes. Beautiful view, great trip, and your ticket is also included parking in Alexandria. So and as I said, we're sold out for every game, and sometimes if the Nats do well, we run 3 or 4 boats to the stadium. So go Nats. We're working with DC United right now and putting a dock in at the end of First Street. And that stadium, if anybody has seen it, is just coming out of the ground quicker than you can believe. the whole Anacostia will in many ways probably start resembling the wharf project in a short time. The development on Anacostia along this river is enormous. And so the need for water transportation there will be enormous. We're working with the airport so that you can get on in Southwest Washington, you get on in Georgetown, get on down here and go to the airport, and where the shuttle comes now and pick you up, take you to the airport. It's a project we've been working on for over 8 years. So it's not a slow bell to get to these projects. It takes time. But it's a real way to cure or help, I guess, the transportation problem that we have in this area, which has just gotten, as everybody said, just worse and worse. And that's all I have. I'm the easy.
So this is your chance to ask questions. There's microphones in each aisle. Does anyone have a question for our panelists? Yes, ma'am. If you can go to the mic because it's being recorded, and you'll follow up. So thank you.
Can you hear me? Is it
Yes,
on?
ma'am.
No? Is it on?
Technician is coming. There it is. It's on.
So I actually have a two-pronged question. One more of a short-term goal, the other one a long-term. Looking at the map for the route, I was curious, I see, if I'm reading it correctly, I see multiple stops. Would it be like the metro is now, how it stops at different stations along the way? The ferry?
You made the map.
Sure, yeah. So the thinking now is that those are probably separate markets and separate runs. So there may be some combinations that we would do, like maybe a boat that would go to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling and then up into the southeast or southwest waterfront, because that's a fairly short stopover that one could do, or from Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, let's say, to the Navy Yard, which is literally across the Anacostia River. So those are really good possibilities. National Harbor right now, because of the approach into National Harbor, is not a very good one to combine with things that are further to the north, because the approach into it is a very long channel that it approaches from the south and goes to the north. So if you have a whole boatload of people who want to get to work in southeast and southwest Washington, D.C., you go in there and stop, and that seems pretty logical, but instead of leaving and going north, you turn south of again, go all the way down and make this big hook to come up and go up through the Wilson Bridge. And it would probably add someplace in the neighborhood of 20, 25 minutes to the commute, and most people would not be willing to tolerate that. So we figured out 2 separate runs, 2 separate markets.
If I may?
Certainly.
And this is from a boat operation perspective purely, I think. So when you talk about taking people out of the cars, which is the thought here, and let's say we take 300 or 400 people up to the Navy Yard, if you like. Well, those people then, many of the Navy Yard people need to go to the Pentagon, or they need to go to Crystal City. They may need to go to Joint Base Anacostia Bowling. They have no vehicle. So what we're really considering is small, fast boats, 49 passenger or less boats, that would then be sort of, I call them intermodal water transportation systems, rather than being on land, be on boats, so that you'll run these boats in a continuous sort of loop between some of these sites, that those people, when they get up there, they have ability then to move around between Alexandria, Arlington, southeast and southwest Washington.
Hey, if I could jump on that one. So that's been very, very successful in the New York area with New York water taxis. They've done the exact same thing. And it's just like a taxi on the water, and they just run steady, and you'll see people wait at the stops, and it's not, you can even, there are apps to tell you where the boat is in its route, so you know, hey, 7 minutes from now, I gotta be at this spot to pick it up, and they just run all day long, and they're very successful. It's a really great model.
And I'll just add one more thing. This is not a new concept. This has been operating in Brisbane, Australia for more than 2 decades.
And then my other question might not be relevant, but since you guys brought up the tourism aspect, I know it was talking about bringing tourism, you know, into Prince William County. I grew up in Prince William County and from Woodbridge, and always remembered going on vacation over to the Delmarva, knowing that if there was ever a bridge that went from Woodbridge straight over, that would cut the commute. Is there ever any future thought process of making the boats large enough to carry cars over to cut down on it that way?
In all of the current work that has been done, there was some reference earlier to the 4 studies that have been done. We have not looked at carrying autos. The last time autos were carried across the Potomac River was sometime in the early 1930s. Not to say that it isn't possible, but the infrastructure requirements and the join into the highway system are even more complex than people on foot. So we've set that aside for now. Is it a long-term possibility? Yes. I mean, there's auto ferries all over the place. I just used Staten Island Ferry as an example, though years and years ago they carried cars back and forth. They still carry emergency vehicles, but most of the time they do not any longer carry cars. They're all foot passengers.
It wasn't that long ago. I was running it back then.
Come on, it's been 40 years.
That old.
No, I'm kidding.
Oh, come on, you guys.
Hi. You mentioned, well, it's very true. It's very difficult to get people out of their cars. And I've lived in Belmont for decades, was born and raised 5 or 6 generations native Northern Virginia. And traffic has always been an issue here, and the thing about getting people out of their cars has a lot to do with how much they value their time, but also how much they're making, right? So we were excited when the VRE came to Belmont because, especially because I worked in Rockville for NIH, and it gave me a way to relax on my way to work, which the commute on the highways would have been horrific, and I had done it many times. So I'm just wondering, you know, and then we got Easy Pass. So for the inside the Beltway job that I'm doing now, I have to say, even when that Easy Pass sign flashes $18 for my commute, I'm like, oh well, it's worth it. But a lot of people would say it's not worth it. And I see a lot of people still on the roadways, even though the Easy Pass is available, for instance, or who are not taking the VRE. Although I think VRE had some growing pains, and now they're doing much better than they were in the initial stages. And I'd love to see this be successful. I guess I'm just wondering, beyond the savings of time in getting people off the roadways, is the major incentive the fact that these ferries are going to less serviced places that the VRE is not necessarily reaching for people who are working in the DC area?
And I'll just use it for instance. If you work in the southeast waterfront down in the Nygaard area, taking VRE in and getting into the southeast waterfront takes a lot of time because it involves a transfer into Metro, and then depending on where you are, on walking to your work site, as opposed to taking the ferry, which will take about the same time, maybe faster, depending on how fast the boats end up being from here to the southeast waterfront. Is actually less time or about the same as VRE, and then you don't have the transfer to the other mode to get to work. So, and I think one of the things we're actually hoping is that not everybody that's in a car decides they want to take the ferry, because if that happens, we'll have our hands full. So it is something that will develop over time. It becomes another alternative, which greatly increases sort of the resilience of the commuter market. I wouldn't necessarily expect everyone to take it every single day, but I would expect it to become a viable alternative for enough people to actually make a substantial difference in the commute.
I'd like to thank you all for putting up with the public on occasion. I'm one of the folks who does work at the Washington Navy Yard, and for a while I was at Buzzard Point after our building got shut up. So my question is related to whether there's an opportunity for everybody that's working on this project to interact with our legislators to consider an authorization to increase the current federal subsidy for transportation, which is at $255 a month, and therefore might help underwrite some of the costs a little bit more. I look forward to the opportunity to ride the ferry because it would give me an alternate for riding VRE and spending about 8 minutes walking from the metro station to the Washington Navy Yard. My second point in question is a little bit more technical because the commercial shipping is migrating to a fully automated tracking system for reporting where the ships are. And the question is whether there's a regulatory need under Merit or ferry operations to have the ATS system on ferries to assist with tracking in case there's a problem with a ferry.
Well, I can tell in AIS, we have it on our boats now.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Thank you.
Yep.
And from a regulatory, Marriott's a promotional agency, not regulatory, so we don't mandate that kind of thing.
Okay. But they
Coast
might-
Guard.
Jim, what do you think?
Well, I don't work for the Coast Guard, right? But I can tell you this, I don't know about a regulatory requirement, but I know that from my experience in New York, all of those boats have not only tracking systems on them, AIS, but that's available to not just the government, but to the rider. So any person, just like you could download an Uber app, can download the ferry app and find out the position of all of these boats at any time so you can plan your trip. So it's even gone beyond the government knowing where the boats are. It's given the public the ability to see where those boats are at any point in time so they can plan, you know, whether they can make it to the next stop or not.
Okay.
If
Thank
you want to see that in action, just go to Washington State Ferry's website and look at what's called Vessel Watch. And it'll tell you where every vessel in their fleet is underway at that given time. You can actually watch the boats move across Puget Sound.
I've ridden them up there once or twice, but the opportunity is still there for input to our legislators for having the federal subsidy for transportation increase. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm with you on the subsidy for federal workers too.
We were fortunate to get it restored back to the same amount that the parking subsidy was here a couple of years ago because they cut it back about 4 years ago, and it was just about 2 years ago now that it's back to what it was before. So maybe we're making progress.
I'm not a commuter, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. And my question is about the weekends. Are you going to be working on the weekends so we could bring our kids to enjoy the ride? I took my kids today and they really like it. And it's important for me to know if we're going to be able to enjoy the service over the weekends.
Well, I think if I understood the question from Jim was saying, will we operate on weekends? I think the answer is yes, but I think it's a different market. So I think the attractiveness of MGM to many people in the casino on the weekend or going into Washington to enjoy Washington, that type of thing is something, it'll be a different schedule. Then I would presume that our commuter schedule would be something that starts early in the morning and then resumes in the late afternoon coming back. I think the weekend schedule will probably be more something that started at 9 or 10 in the morning and stopped at 9 or 10 at night. So the answer to you is, we're contemplating, you want to use your equipment as many hours as you can.
All right.
That's the best way to say that.
Is it going to be the same price for adults and children?
Same price.
For adults and children.
Reduced price for children.
Typically, the child's price for us has been 50% of the adult price in all our boats, so I think that would probably hold true.
Thank you.
Under two is free.
Thank you. No, I don't have to.
Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I have two questions. One is about ice in the winter. How would you close down the system, or would there be ice breakers? And two, how do you protect the passengers from other passengers? Somebody has a gun or something like that.
I can answer the operational hours or the winter ice issue. You get about 3 weeks of ice on the Potomac. In some areas, like National Harbor in that bay there, the Washington Channel, where the water doesn't flow very quickly, down by Potomac shores, just south of here where the river bends so much, the ice buildup can be significant. But we're looking at 3 weeks, 21 days, not necessarily 21 days in a row, that we have an ice issue on the river and we couldn't operate, or couldn't operate maybe a complete service. What you're going to end up doing, instead of being able to run 40 miles an hour, 40 knots if you like, you may be operating at 5 or 10, because you'd have to go slow because of the ice flows. So I think the alternative for us then is to make sure, working with one of our partners, that we have bus service then to provide on the same ticket price for those days.
I can take the protection as far as the regulations go. There's a thing called MARSAC. It's a maritime security level, and that's set by the Department of Homeland Security depending on the current threat. Right now we're operating at MARSAC 1, which would be the lowest level, and that requires passenger vessels to perform certain percentages of screening, both of passengers, baggage, and autos. I don't want to say similar to the airport, because it's not, but it's screening of passengers, what they carry on, and vehicles, if there were vehicles to be carried. So that's already in place.
Sorry, I have 2 more questions. First one is, for when it comes to payment, is there any system that's going to be set up much like, the Smart Trip card, where if you do want to ride the ferry service on a regular basis, you can have like an ongoing card that you just swipe through, or is it going to be single pay each time?
We're looking, I can tell you, for the wharf project, not only do we have an app coming out for that, but we're looking at a monthly card, if you want to call it that. Yes.
And then,
I'll just add to that, in an ideal world, the system would be fully integrated. And it may take a while to get there, but similar to the ferries that run up and down the Thames River in England, the Oyster card, which is the transit card all over London, is good on the ferries. It's been operating that way in Hong Kong for probably close to 25 years now, where the same card that's good on the subway is also good on all the ferries, and there are multiple different operators that operate in Hong Kong ferries. So other places have been able to make it work. I'm pretty confident we'll be able to make it work here too.
so is that planned for, with the new service starting in October? First, I was wondering if you have a specific date for when the service is going to start in October, and then is the goal to very quickly ramp it up to where they can all be integrated, the transportation payments?
Well, the wharf service, if that's what you're asking about, the Southwest service,
Yes.
that will start October 12th. And I think, to add to what Tim was saying, in San Francisco, if you ride the ferry, that same card can be used on their what I call their metro system.
Called the Clipper card.
Yep.
And are you guys currently speaking with Metro, or?
We've been approved by Metro to be part of the system.
And will that start on October 12th?
I don't see that we're going to be a commuter boat per se in the wharf that would tie in with that. I think the service here would definitely be that type of system.
Any other questions? Gentleman over here. Hi, gentleman.
I'm
and then
Zach from Homeland area. First, I want to thank you all and thank Supervisor Principi for putting this together. I appreciate that you don't respect public by acknowledging that $10 million for a ferry is a significant amount of money, but compared to like a metro train, it's not bad. The operating cost is probably more, but quality of life improvement from not on a commute where you won't get in an accident, but a commute that's actually equal to people's weekend hobbies, I think is awesome. And people pay a few $1,000s more a year to drive a car that they sit up higher or can go scary fast in principle. So yeah, looking forward to a boat. I had a question about transparency in the costs for the plans, which is, I've heard earlier on the boat that the option being studied was for a boat that would go 22, 26 knots would not be practical to get to downtown Washington from here in a reasonable time. There's other, then I heard $10 million for a boat that could get to downtown Washington. I see examples of ticket prices that, for further questioning, reveals that would not cover the capital cost of the docks or the boats. So where could the public expect to stay informed about the full cost of the project and then after that the possible sources of funding for it? Because if the government pays for it, it's coming out of money that could be used for instance, more affordable buses, our general budget. How can we keep informed on that?
So the Maritime Administration publishes all of our, on our website, we publish all our designated projects, of which this is one. And we also publish grant awards, so people can see how much money that we've put in towards this particular project. In this case, a $173,000 grant so far. The Federal Transit Administration, which has also provided a grant for this effort, has published that on their website. And I believe NBRC also has put a lot of the information in terms of costs that have been invested in it so far on their website as well. So there's lots of information currently on the web in terms of what's been spent.
Okay, looking forward to keeping informed with details about what the plans to commit to the government, how much to support this is. On the issue of the infrastructure costs, it seems to me that the particular locations where the terminals are set up, especially at the Homeland, would get a lot of benefits from being right near there. But for instance, if the ferry stopped here, they would get great traffic for the restaurants here. Developer of condos could advertise, hey, you step right onto your own, essentially, public marina. Has have planners looked into private developers permitting the shared use of their facilities for the ferry infrastructure, or for defraying some of the cost of that?
I think the answer is a combination of all of the above, and I think that we don't really know site by site yet what exactly the arrangements are going to be. We're trying to first identify what kind of improvements need to be there and what the pros and cons of each site are, and we're still a long ways from figuring out the financial arrangement for the entire operation. So in some cases, private developers have put in significant amounts of funding into development of waterfront operations, especially in Washington, D.C., and in other cases not so much. So it's a real mixed bag.
Looking forward to that. And finally, I noticed at least as an anecdote, that the VRE train system here, which I ride every day and enjoy, started with train cars that were bought and repainted from another transit system. So an engineer here mentioned that there is a market for used ferry boats, and sometimes they need some local adaptation. So if it would be possible to start off the service with not a new boat, but a boat that conveyed the basic experience, see if it catches on. I think that would be a great move for responsibility, fiscal responsibility in our area.
Yes, sir.
And I also just want to thank you for doing this. It's been an idea that's been on my mind for a long time. And I just want to ask, what is your starting, how many ferries do you have to start with? Is it like 3 in the mornings and 3 to come back in the evenings? What's the minimum number? And then which point in DC are you having, if you're having a fast ferry from here, I presume it's just to one point is the Navy Yard the best spot? For instance, the Pentagon is probably more easily reached on that night ferry. So, do you have one particular spot?
Well, I'll try and answer the question because it's got a lot of tentacles, I guess. And I'll hit the last part, the Pentagon, with you first. So the Pentagon, if you've ever gone on GW Parkway and go over a little bridge called the Humpback Bridge, the height clearance under that bridge is about 13 feet, and the radius is like this. It's very narrow. So a boat that we're talking about that could carry 300 people and go 40 miles an hour would never fit underneath the 14th Street Bridge, let alone make it under the Humpback Bridge. And so when I was referring, I think earlier that I said you would end up maybe building smaller boats that could run to the Pentagon, that could run to some of these other locations. Once people got set at Navy Yard, JPAB, what have you, would be the type of boat that we could go to the Pentagon. When we know what the market is, in other words, how many people would be interested in going to these different locations, then you can see what time do they have to be there, and when you have to leave to get them there. And whatever that volume is will dictate, are you building one boat or two boats? Clearly you start with one. But I think you've got to walk a little bit before you run with this project. And today, for instance, I believe in water transportation. I believe that it will work great here. I haven't seen any data that will tell me that it is a viable market other than my gut. Right? Once you have that, and once you know the schedule of people and know where they're going, then you can plan. It may be that you build 3 150 passenger boats that can go 40 miles an hour because you want to make that time run instead of one 300 passenger or 400 passenger. We're not there yet. I think that's the answer for you about if it's one boat, two boats, three boats, or what the size of the boats will be. But can't get to the Pentagon, not with a big boat.
Gentlemen, thank you for your time this evening. I have 2 questions. First off, you mentioned a number of challenges to begin with, environmental, financial, and so forth. And I was wondering if you had a particular time frame in mind when you think you'll be able to overcome those challenges in order to start service here in the Woodbridge area. And my second question had to do with, is there any avenue for any sort of public investment in order to help overcome some of your financial challenges?
You offer those up, so that's your answer.
Well, I can't tell you when they're going to start because it's Willem's project. But I can, right, how was that? I am a government employee. I know how to do that. But I can tell you this. I don't know of a public-private partnership, at least in the New York area where I saw, hundreds of ferries operate. I do know of joint ventures that succeeded, where different investors got together initially to fund, the gentleman who talked about, and they were joint between a developer on the land side, someone who had the land. So there's 2 big challenges. There's the vessel, well, way more than 2, but there's the land side. Does it have the infrastructure to support? There's the vessel, okay, and then the land side on the other end, right? So there was a mix of investors. I know in New York, because it was private, at least a lot of the operations, where developers, Port Liberté is one of them, brand new development opens up with hundreds and hundreds of different condos, and they were working with a piece of the Direct Line Harbor Commuter Company to fund boats right from that development into the city. So that has worked in the past and can work. I don't know of a situation where the public, like a stock, could invest into a ferry company. And when you talk about subsidies, I don't know if I mentioned, I was talking to somebody today, Staten Island Ferry, which carries 60,000 people a day, the charge is 0. So that's 100% subsidized by the city of New York. Used to be, it ran through different iterations, so I think when I ran it, it was a quarter, it might have gone as high as 50 cents, it was a dime, it was a nickel, and I forget under which mayor.
I think I paid $2.
$2?
Yeah.
You know, did you just pay some guy to run it? So could
But
have
it
been.
was a while ago.
All right, it was like, yeah. Yeah, that would have been me, sorry. I owe you two. But, okay, but it's gone the range, but New York City, and I can't tell you I might have been Giuliani, I forget which mayor, decided to say, look, it's doing such good relieving traffic on the highways, there's such a need, it's reducing, it's helping the environment, so they made it free. And they have turnstiles, if you've ever been there, just to count the people, so the city knows how much of a subsidy to give the ferry based on the amount of riders they have. There's no charge for that.
I think the advocacy part on public is to let people like Frank Principi know what your thinking is, if you support it, and he can direct you about how to use your vote, if you like, your presence to let the public officials know this is something you want for Prince William County.
I will also offer up that in New York City, San Francisco, Seattle, Boston, just to name a few, that much of the public investment is in the shoreside. In New York City, that's particularly true. If it wasn't for some early investments by the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey in ferry terminal construction, and they've got some beautiful terminals there in Manhattan, that rebuilt the Hoboken, old Hoboken ferry terminal. It is a marvel of passenger-only ferry operations now. If it not for the public investment in those, the ferry service would not be nearly as successful in New York as it is today. Most of the ferries operating on the Hudson River on the west side of Manhattan are all privately operated. They're operating completely on their own with very little subsidy. On the East Channel, it's a different story. The city of New York continues to subsidize those as a way to continue to build the market. One other thing that wasn't talked about earlier on, after Superstorm Sandy, the first mode of transportation that was reopened and operating again were the ferries on the Hudson River. So not only did they rescue people from the airliner crash, but they were extremely important after 9/11. The Staten Island ferry was key in moving thousands and thousands of people off lower Manhattan to safer locations because the subway system was completely down out of there. And the other ferries up in Midtown also moved a lot of people who had come from Lower Town, fled Midtown out. And again, after Superstorm Sandy, it was the first thing up and operating, and has really helped New York City with its resilience.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm a representative for local press, and my question was really, what are the next steps that need to happen here to meet that 5-year timeline? And I don't know if anyone up here can speak to this, but I was wondering, what will the grant money, the FTA grant money specifically be used for? Do we know yet? And who will decide?
So that's actually part of the scope of work that we're working on right now, is to identify the location and the best use for that FTA grant that is existing out there. That's really the point.
And we pick on each other. I would say, I can tell you where we are, and that is we're negotiating leases, a lease to put a ferry terminal here on the Occoquan. Once we get the market study done, we're prepared to go ahead and work on putting a system together, building a boat, spending the money. So we're not in a 5-year plan. We're in a much shorter plan because we think the market's here. We just got to prove it to ourselves, and so it's bankable.
Wow, so how soon do you think?
Well, you're a year to build a boat. Let's put it 1 year for that. If Frank Principi can grease the skids and make the permit process for putting docks in go quicker, but let's say you need 6 months to go through a permit process, and then we're hoping that in another couple months we may know what the market study is going to tell us. But those are the things that you need. You need a long-term lease. You need to know there's a market, and then you can pay for the boat. And if we're lucky enough to work something out with Marriott or someone else, that's great. Other than that, we'll fund it. We funded the 4 boats that we built for the wharf. Once we got a long-term lease for them and determined who was going to put the docks in and pay for that and the infrastructure costs up there, we went and wherever Carl is, sitting right there, we chose his shipyard, which is a great shipyard, Metal Shark in Louisiana, and we commissioned 4 boats. And when the first 2 will be here, hopefully within a week, and the next 2 will be here in March.
And do you have a local location that you're looking at right now that you
My favorite would be Belmont Bay, and mainly because it's closer to the main river, which reduces the time frame. So if I leave here and go to the main river, it's 11 minutes longer than if I left from Belmont Bay to go to the main river. And so, as you've heard, it's all about time. If I can keep that time in 45, 50 minutes to run that route from here, if you want Belmont Bay, to Washington D.C. somewhere, southwest, or the Navy Yard, I think that's a time frame that people will then get out of their cars and get on my ferry.
And do you have in mind destination points yet, or do you wait for the market and study?
Well, we have docking rights at the Navy Yard now. We are exclusive to National Harbor. We have we dock in Georgetown, we dock at the mall, and so we put the dock in at the Kennedy Center. So the answer is we have multiple places we can dock right now.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us, and Supervisor Principi. My question is, there's a lot of us in Belmont Bay that are retired and would like to see a ferry that we could ride in the daytime, not just at peak times in the morning and evening. We'd like to be able to go into DC and tour around, and it would be a great opportunity for us. We'd love to have you build the dock there at Belmont Bay. We just moved there a year ago, and we love it. It's a wonderful community, and I think a lot of this needs to have a lot of marketing done so other people realize that there is something down here, because a lot of people don't know about Belmont Bay. We have found that out, that there's, it's kind of a wow factor when we've told them that there's a community down here on the river, and nobody realizes that. So are you thinking about doing something like that for, that would be an all-day trip, or, several times a day that we could be taking it?
No, not yet. And I'm not slighting you at all. I mean, I think the question is, you take, if it was 1 boat or 2 boats, let's just say that, and you ran up to Washington, is the market telling you that you're going to come back to Belmont Bay at noon and run another boat later in the day, or take people to MGM as a different trip? We haven't gotten that far, and I would tell you that I think I'm 7 years in dealing with the Carruthers family at Belmont Bay to get to a lease point discussion with them. So this is a slow process, some of these pieces. Once you get them in place, you can then act. And we haven't had the pleasure of thinking about what would the daytime market be. We don't know what it is.
Okay. Thank you.
I just wonder, can you start with small boats to establish the market? Something like Venice, Italy?
You say start with smaller boats?
Yeah, very small, just to establish the market.
Well, the cost, again, is almost like a pilot program. What you call a small boat, what I call a small boat may be something different, but you're still spending $1 million at a minimum. And so if you determine the market is worth a $10 million boat, or 300 passengers, or 40 miles an hour, whatever it may be, once you make that decision, that's going to dictate what the boat's going to look like. We run 5 or 6 149 passenger boats now in the Washington metropolitan area. They run at about a 45% load factor on average. There's some days that they're sold out completely, particularly on the weekends. So does it mean you get a 300 passenger boat then to do that market? Then you end up with more fuel, more crew needed, more this, more that, and so your margins become smaller and smaller. To run here, again, the boats that we run up in the Washington Channel, let's say up in the Washington area above the Wilson Bridge, the wind condition up there, for instance, at 15 knots is maybe a half foot of water, of wave, that same wind factor down here, because it's so open, could be 2-foot seas. Those boats would get pounded down here. So we're saying run a small boat. Boy, I don't know if I could design, or Carl could design a small boat that could take the wave action down here when it's blowing. You lose your market. So I think it's, you know, the answer is probably no from us, and the reasons are as I stated.
Anyone else? Supervisor Principi? Oh, sir, go ahead.
Talked a few times about the fact that you were doing market analysis to determine if there'd be enough ridership to have a boat down here. One of the handouts around the room said market analysis findings, MBRC on the front. And on the back it talks about modeling a route from Woodbridge to DC and model particular fares and trip times and things like that. But it said ridership in the range of 100 to 200 trips per day wasn't sufficient to sustain the operation. There was no indication, though, about how close that might be to sufficient. I was wondering what number of riders you're looking at per day to make it sufficient to operate a business.
Dave, but it's your question about how many riders it would take. I'll talk about the study. You notice there's also a number of conditions that were listed there that would change what that market looks like. And some of those conditions have actually come to pass. So we're actually in the process of re-looking at that entire market right now, which is what Willem was referring to as the market analysis. As far as what his breakover point is, there's a lot of depends on. It depends on how many boats, depends on how big the boat, depends on how fast it's running. But you have a general sense, Willem, what it would take?
You know, I think if you have somewhere between 200 and 300 people initially when that want to run to Washington, just as a general area, on a day, I think that would be, and you had a commitment for that, you would build a boat to fit that need. And I think there was a question earlier from someone about why can't you buy a used boat? And you know, I've been at this for a long time, and I think you need to build a boat to fit the product that you're doing. You can't just convert something to make it work. You end up with nothing in the end. So if you know you have 200 people, you know you have 300 people, whatever it may be, then you make those decisions based on that.
One of the other things I want to point out, just a physical limitation, it is a considerable distance from here to Washington, D.C., which means that even with the kind of boats that we're talking about, say ideally something that would make a 45-minute one-way time, by the time it gets turned around and back here, it's 2 hours after it left again, which means that with only one boat, the best you can do is a trip about roughly every 2 hours. It might even be a little bit longer than that, depending on the turnaround times and the docking times. So if you start thinking about the typical commute period, and when people want to get to work, 2 hours is kind of at the early end, depending on when you set that time, and it's at the late end. So you're in this game of playing, if I've only got one boat to work with, what's my ideal time to capture the largest market? And that's another piece of the equation that needs to fall into place. In an ideal world, you'd run a minimum of 3 trips during that 2-hour time frame where most people are trying to get to work. And you know, the first trip is going to take a certain load for people that start work earlier, the traditional work day that is earlier. The middle trip's always going to be the heavy trip, and the late trip is going to be for the people that tend to start a little bit later and it'll have a load on it. But that's about, in the commuter market, that's about the minimum you can really think about.
Once again, thank you to our panelists. Ask our supervisor to wrap up. Just two quick things. Our next meeting of the steering committee is October 26th on the other side of the river with our friends from Maryland. And Tim's this study is due to be completed at the end of December. And so that's a hard deadline that we have with Marin. Supervisor?
Yeah, sorry, Frank. I got something quick. It'll take a second. It's kind of a gift so a gentleman mentioned security here. So we formed, when I was running maritime security programs for the department, we formed a national working group of ferry operators and owners throughout the United States, approximately 20 of the largest operators. And and asked them to identify their biggest security gaps. And so we created 6 different interactive training courses based on the biggest security gaps that those operators identified and things that they would have to train their employees on, from security awareness for passenger vessel employees to screening procedures prior to boarding the boat, crowd control, terminal and shipboard evacuation. This one might not be appropriate. Maritime terrorism and hijacking, I'm going to leave that one for another time. But seriously, all these other ones are collaborations between Homeland Security, Coast Guard, the Joint Improvised Explosive Device Defeat Organization, DoD, and some of the top ferry operators and what I would say some of the brightest minds in the maritime operations field to create this interactive training, which we've distributed over 100,000 copies. Even the Coast Guard uses it for training. A lot of companies use it as pre-employment training before their people can come to work. So I'm going to give you, Frank, this box set. So Naomi for Christmas. As a start. And seriously, as you grow, and I know you will, if you want any more of these, just say the word. We've got, that's just here to look at if you want to know what we got. Thank you. Sure.
And thank you for hanging out. Some of us started here at 12 o'clock with the luncheon, and I know I'm tired. I've had enough ferry for one day. But this kind of event takes quite a number of individuals and sponsors and supporters to make this happen. I just want to take a minute to draw your attention to the back page of the program. The partners that we work with to be able to pull this off today included the Northern Virginia Regional Commission, the Woodbridge Civic Association, as well as the event venue here, Harbour View, Occoquan Marina, and Blue 1681 Restaurant. But we also had several sponsors who were willing to help write a check to underwrite the cost of the event, the food, the bar, the lunch, etc. And I'd like to ask you, to the extent that you can, to let them know if you see them, if you have an opportunity to buy something from them, let them know that you truly appreciate their support of this event and of this potential solution that we call a fast ferry on the river. The other thing I'd like to mention is that we had several media folks in and out during the course of the day. I've already seen a Washington Post article posted online. I'm sure there'll be others. If you'd like to see the video or share the video with friends and neighbors and colleagues at work, I would encourage you to go to whatsuppprincewilliam.com. I get that right? Yep. whatsuppprincewilliam.com. He'll be posting the video up. Please feel free to take a moment to share that with others. The $64,000 question for me after a day of Fast Ferry dialogue with our partners and our stakeholders is, where do we go from here? Quite frankly, during the course of the day, I'm not sure I heard a very concrete answer to that question. Where do we go from here, over what period of time, and exactly what it's going to cost, and it's going to happen on the weekends. But I know what I'm doing going forward. And I'm going to have an ask to all of you going forward as well. Number one, we're keeping this coalition together. We have dozens of organizations from business, from government, from military, academia, that have been working together arm in arm to try to solve some of these really complicated issues. They continue to meet. As part of this 4th study that we've done, we have, as Bob said, 2 more open houses. If you want to come up to National Harbor on October 26th, I get that right? You are all welcome to come up and hear the Maryland perspective of this presentation. And then another one in DC on November 15th? 13th, 1-3. So part of our job is to get the word out, raise awareness, and get you all engaged in this solution. So we invite you to that. The other step forward that we'll be doing is I'm happy to report that the Board of County Supervisors here in Prince William earlier this week has agreed or approved to chase another one of these federal grants we've been talking about. And the deadline for that grant application is next month. and we call it the Tiger Grant. As well, we're working with PRTC, who's in the middle of transforming themselves beyond a bus transit organization to a bus and other transit service organization. And we feel that they're going to be chasing the Fast Ferry discretionary grant that's also due next month. And with the money that we've already received from FTA, with a couple more awards, well, I think we got a few peanuts here that begins to address some of the capital needs, shoreside capital needs that this study is focused on and due in December. And the ask for all of you. This ain't gonna happen unless you all get engaged. I'm a champion. You don't need to call me. I love your emails and calls, but you don't need to call me. Tomorrow morning, you need to think about whether or not this is a good idea for you and your family or your business, and reach out to the other members of the Board of County Supervisors. Reach out to the members of the General Assembly in Richmond. Let them know what you think about Fast Ferry Service. Ask them to get on board. Yeah, get on board. I think I can use that euphemism. Get on board and support this moving forward, because it's going to take a village. It's going to take all of us moving in that direction in order to get it done. And I'm a big fan of doing it a step at a time, incrementally, right? Nobody's going to write a check. Nobody's going to bring a fleet of boats here tomorrow. But if we can start small, Mr. Market, Mr. Polak, if we can start small, prove the concept, generate and expand the market, I'm convinced we will get there to what we all want in the future. I took the same lesson learned from Route 1. When I came in office 10 years ago, we had traffic congestion on Route 1. We had a lot of ugly, blighted buildings on Route 1. We had what I call my tinker toys on Route 1. Those are those telephone poles, those light poles, every 10 feet, right? And the wires were, right? And people said, VDOT approached me and said, Frank, if you can write a check for $500 million, that's with a B, $500 million, we can start tomorrow. And I said, no, we don't need to write a $500 million check. What we need to do is write a $100 million check and get this portion done. And then another $150 million check to get this portion done. I'm happy to say there's a $500 million in the account today. And I'll apologize in advance because, construction's going on right now. But by 2021, we will have a completely transformed Route 1, and I think a completely transformed and what we call New Woodbridge. And I see Fast Ferry as part and parcel of that, because if we don't find other transit solutions, we're going right back to where we came from, and that's car-choked, traffic-congested roads. And for us not to chase that $3.5–4 million FTA grant that's already been awarded to us, shame on us. So there's a sense of urgency with some deadlines, there's some money hanging out there. So I need all of you to let your elected officials know what you think about this, so that they too can get on board and we can all move together as a community, as a New Woodbridge, to get this done. Big round of applause for all of you for hanging in there and being here tonight. Thank you. And I'm happy to say this concludes the program. Thank you all for coming.